Thank you for showing up for this Let's Talk Climate Change. It's a small turnout, unfortunately, but we understand it's a weekday evening. And also in the university, we are on a semester break, so that's probably turned things into like that. So I am from the Center for Climate Change at Azim Premji University, and we have been doing or organizing these Let's Talk Climate Change series for a few months now. Today we are very happy to actually have with us Josh Rosenthal. So before I introduce the speaker, let me say maybe a few things about what we do from the center. So we are a relatively new center. In addition to doing research in climate change, we take climate communication and climate education quite seriously. So we have our undergraduate program in environmental science and sustainability that we started this semester. And we have been organizing what we call the climate festivals for the last couple of years. So what we do, working for about a year, we organize one festival, climate festival. The last year we did Rivers of Life Festival. This year we just completed in November Forest of Life Festival, and next year we are planning to do Mountains of Life Festival. So we bring in a lot of students from around this area. We hire interns from all across India to help them, and encourage them to build a story. And so that's communication part, or like helping students to understand, to look at different components of the environment, not only with a negative view, but also with a view so that they can think about how they can fix some of the problems, and also thinking about maybe a brighter future. And as I said, we take climate communication quite seriously. We are going around the country working with journalists, and we have been organizing these data journalism workshops in different parts of India. So we just completed 1 year of that. And then we do webinars, and then we do public talk series, among other things. So this is part of our activities, actually, communication activities. So I'm very happy to have Josh Rosenthal with us today. So he is a health ecologist and Fulbright climate scholar for this year. And he is a senior scientist at the Fogarty International Center of the US National Institutes of Health. And currently he's just finishing up your 3.5 month tenure, right, in Chennai. So he has a long standing interest in the integration of public health, environment, and international development. And over the years, he developed and led NIH research and training programs on environment and health in many countries around the world, including in India. So his recent work is focused on primarily on reducing household air pollution from cooking with solid fuels, and on research programs to reduce the health impacts of climate change. During his current Fulbright Kalam Fellowship, he's working with faculty at Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education Research in Chennai to create a new curriculum on climate change and health for public health professionals. So having said that, welcome Josh, and please come on over, and we are eager to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for coming. So what I would like to do is spend approximately about 40 minutes to provide an overview of the impacts we believe that climate change is bringing to public health, and end with some thoughts about where we can go to address that. Now, the title of the talk is Hot Public Health and Medicine in a Hot, Flat, and Crowded World. It's based on a book that I like very much. Also, I like the title, by a commentator, sometime ecologist, internationalist, Thomas Friedman, of the New York Times, where he is looking at the global trajectory. This book is a few years old, and he's updated it a bit, but thinking hard about the global transformation that is ongoing, both environmentally, demographically, and economically, and how we must change the way we behave, the way we run our economies to survive, frankly. I'm going to start with crowded. And this will be mostly things that you know at one level or another, but perhaps you'll learn a couple of things. So first, so I was born in 1959, and at that time, the world's population was about 3 billion people. So in the course of my lifetime, population has gone now to more than double, to getting close to tripling. It's at 8 billion now. And the UN predicts that by 2050s, 60s, it'll level out at around 10 billion, maybe closer to 11. The numbers conjugate. So it's a dramatic change in the density of people and on the planet. Most of that growth has taken place during that same time frame in China, India, and the continent of Africa. You'll see less growth in Europe. Latin America and North America have grown slowly, but not nearly the same. And if we look very locally here in Bangalore, the numbers are really startling. And of course, only perhaps a third of this growth from 1 million people in 1950 to 12 to 13 million today is related to birth. A great deal of that is, of course, to immigration from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. But it is stunning transformation of the planet. Now, by flat, what Friedman was referring to really was the hyperconnectivity around the world in several respects. But one is illustrated here, and that is the fact that we can basically go from any point in the world to any other point in the world in less than 2 days by air travel. That's really pretty much in the last 20, 30 years that you could move that fast, that far. Here's a map of the 67,000 some odd routes of air travel connecting 10,000 airports around the world, just to give you a sense of how extensive that connection is and how fast people can move. We not only move individually, but we move in large migratory populations, at least in continuous streams. And of course, the traditional population centers or migratory pathways were to North America, Western Europe, Australia. But now, in recent years, there's greater and greater migration to new, in the dark red, Mexico, parts of South America, South Africa, Eastern Europe, parts of India, elsewhere where I see these are now centers that are accumulating people. So global migration is also expanding rapidly, but beyond the traditional destinations. And then most strikingly is the volume of stuff and services that move around the planet now at remarkable speed. So this is an index of world trade. If you say 1950, which is the prime period we've been talking about, if that index was at 100, today it's 4,500. So 45-fold increase in the volume of goods and services that flow around the world. So that is ships, containers, airplanes, everything that you can imagine. And of course, we all use many of those things every day. Now, hot is the part of this talk, and I'll spend most of the rest of my time talking about climate change and its interconnection with these other variables. But and of course, this series is dedicated to climate change, and so appropriately enough, I'd like you to take a look at this map, which is from August, the warmest August in history, as far as we know. And this is a measure of, this is a map, shows the temperature anomalies by degrees centigrade from the historical average from 1951 to 1980. And what you see is that, in fact, while overall the planet's average increased relative to that time is, was it shown to about a 1 degree now? But in many places of the world, it's 2 to 4 degrees already, at least that August. Of course, it's dynamic. This is, I find, here's India, and you might stare at that. If you have questions, we can talk about it later. But it's interesting that it's hot or here relative average and not so much north in part of that plain. And I think there are some interesting reasons why, but we perhaps could talk about it. The implications of all this radical change across the planet is, of course, extreme weather, among other items. And the IPCC 2021 report was flagged by the UN Secretary General as code red for humanity. And what we see is that the frequency and intensity, or the frequency of very intense droughts, rainstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, even freezes in some areas are increasing in time with devastating consequences today, yet alone what's coming in the future. So to think a little bit more directly about the relationship of climate change to health, I'm going to sort of draw a little pathway for you that may be helpful. So the changes that we think about with climate, so increased global temperature, weather changes, precipitation, sea level rise, changes in the weather conditions for raising crops, then are felt more directly in heat, air pollution, water quality, dynamics of infectious and vector-borne diseases, changes in allergens, other things that more directly affect people. Those then have measurable health impacts in heat, chronic diseases such as cardiovascular and stroke, of course injuries, mental, neurological, zoonotic, vector-borne, and respiratory diseases, among others. So from a public health and medical standpoint, the question becomes, yes, climate mitigation is critical, and we all need to be doing something about that. But you also need to think about what are the interventions that will allow us to be prepared for the inevitable changes that we're already seeing and are likely to get much more extreme. So strategies, and we'll talk a bit more about some of these in the latter part, but interventions and strategies that help us prepare ourselves and our communities from harm. The health effects in particular that people are focused on and that we find measurable differences related to climate change, there are come in both direct effects here on the left, heat, respiratory, food and water, injury, et cetera. And then indirect effects that are effects that such as chemical releases, changes in air and water quality, population displacement, interruptions to healthcare services, poverty-related infrastructure factors that have sometimes very consequential impacts on human health. That pathway is influenced and mediated by both environmental and social factors. Is one way to think about it. So if you look at top here, climate drivers, and the health outcomes on the bottom, and they go through those exposure pathways that I talked about a slide or two back, the impact of all those are greatly mediated by land use change, geography, the agricultural production, infrastructure in a town or in a countryside, as well as the social and behavioral context that affect vulnerability of people to those pathways. And the health effects are also very difficult to measure in a linear fashion because they are cross-sectoral. So the impacts of climate change can be felt, as I mentioned, directly on health, but often go through agricultural or economic, transportation, or environmental changes from climate that then impinge on health. And so these all interact in quite complex ways to have, this is just using heat as an example of how that comes about. So let's talk a little bit about infectious diseases and why do infectious diseases become more, some infectious diseases are of concern because of climate change. Fundamentally, that the change in weather and climate changes the ranges of both vectors and hosts for animals and allows those to migrate. It affects the transportation and transmission susceptibility of both the hosts and directly pathogens, and then ultimately affects the geographical spread of disease. If we think about zoonotic diseases, which are some of those which occur like COVID with a very rapid and sometimes unpredictable outcome, many of those are diseases that are spillovers from animals, either domesticated or wildlife, that have a regular cycle there, but we don't notice them so much because there's a background immunity until they spill over into another animal, another host. But some of our most important infectious diseases, many of those are, both viral and bacterial diseases, reflect this spillover dynamic between the sort of livestock, wildlife, and humans. And this interrelationship is now becoming its own management framework as One Health, where you manage especially infectious diseases and all three of those sort of populations together. But not dependent on extreme weather, we can think about average changes also being extremely important. So 20 years ago, 25 years ago, dengue, which is a virus transmitted by a mosquito, Aedes aegypti, was very uncommon in India, or at least not well reported. Perhaps it's more common and not well documented than we know. But since then, there has been a steady increase to where it's becoming of significant concern. In fact, a colleague of mine, one of her graduate students, just died of dengue hemorrhagic fever just about 2 months ago. A healthy young man, just didn't take it seriously and caught up with him very quickly. And this is substantially related to increases in warm weather and water that is standing for longer periods of time. Frequent rainfall that leaves puddles. And in urban areas are particularly susceptible because of where water sits in concrete and doesn't go. So it's twinned, sort of increased urbanization and changes in climate are showing globally an increased distribution of dengue in places where it didn't used to be. Let's see here. So another important dynamic that gets a fair amount of attention, I think, in the press here in India is the relationship to agriculture and to food, with good reason. So with increasing droughts or just simply the disruption in the monsoons that support so much of the agriculture in India, but of course around the world this is happening as well. So production of food is changing quickly and losing large crops to unpredictable weather patterns of all sorts, from heat to rainfall and others. An interesting thing is not only is the production and therefore scarcity, food security an issue, but the nutrient quality appears also to be changing from a more direct meteorological event, and that is increased CO2 concentration, which is what plants take up. As they take up higher rates of CO2, it appears that the concentration of proteins and several nutrients, critical nutrients, is going down in concentration in food plants. And so we're starting to see some mineral deficiencies where we thought they should be at least calorie sufficient and therefore otherwise okay. Extreme weather events, as I've mentioned before, are growing more common. This is a map of, now I've forgotten the time frame, I think it's about 5 years, that shows a series of extreme weather events around the world: floods, droughts, cyclones, wildfires, ice storms. The ones in red are those which have been tied to climate change specifically. That is, they're attributable statistically to the deviation of climate from its historical averages. So one of those extreme weather events, wildfires, is becoming a very common problem in the United States. So my wife and I grew up in California, and we grew up with a wet season and a dry season. Now this year there's a wet season, from the last 5 years, a wet season, a dry season, and a smoke season, because the wildfires take off through many of the forests across the western United States, and blanket much of the country with smoke, which of course is, for people, very bad to breathe, but presents many, many other challenges. But interestingly, it's not just what happens locally. So on the top here, this last summer, there was a very, very serious spate of wildfires across Canada for lots of historical reasons, of multi-year droughts. And as you can see, those wildfires created air pollution that wasn't necessarily as big a problem in the West, but was in the East Coast. So the smoke from the Canadian wildfires came down and created huge problems in the Northeast United States. So what happens far away can also affect people right nearby. Among the extreme weather events that are most devastating is floods. Many of you have followed, or at least are aware of, the floods that occurred in Pakistan last year, where I think almost 40% of the country was underwater at one point. Extraordinarily devastating. At least the references I found, over 100,000 people are displaced, at least 1,700 killed, and still a year later, 8 million people, including 4 million children, do not have access to safe drinking water 1 year later. So it's devastating not only at the time, but there is a continuing impact on morbidity, mortality, as well as, of course, the economies. Beyond those kind of direct effects, floods also are incredibly disruptive. And one of the things they do is distribute contaminants, toxic waste, hazardous waste, oil, even things that are just in small concentrations begin to be spread around the world. This is in Texas, where there was a large fire, a large flood, and there's been a lot of work by my organization to help sort out how to minimize that in the future. And then, of course, when there are floods, people can't get to the hospitals. Hospitals lose power, their record systems are lost, physicians can't get, and nurses can't get to the hospitals, their supplies can't be, they're incredibly disruptive. In Puerto Rico, 5 years ago, there was a major hurricane and floods. 5 years later, it's still very difficult to get medical care on much of the island. So it's a long-lasting, devastating impact. So I had an opportunity, very apropos for my time here in India, to study climate change and health, because I was in Chennai over the last couple of weeks, and got a first-hand look at a flood, extreme weather event and associated flood. And so what I did was took that map that I showed a little while ago about the sectoral interactions between those, and went through the news to see how that map reports about what was happening in Chennai just last week, a week and a half ago. What we do know is that at least 23 people have died. It's probably much more than that. My colleagues at Ramachandra Hospital are saying there's a long queue at the cremation site across the road. So then we'll see what that looks like. It hasn't been studied yet. But if you look through the newspapers, which I did, beyond the 18,000 people displaced and the deaths from electrocution and trauma and drowning, you have these other sequelae, infections, mental health, depression, trauma, of course, food security, and people who can't get to the hospital have interrupted disease care for many reasons. So I sat down and I walked through this, and this is hard to look at, and I don't expect you to consume it all, but I just wanted you to notice that how well, if you map extreme rainfall onto that same pattern, you have massive power outages, flooded roads and tracks on the runways. The trains weren't running, the airport was closed down. Those have enormous impacts, of course, on transportation and everything that depends on it, on the economy, and those have then direct effect on healthcare and mobility. Kids don't go to school. Further, the crops in the surrounding areas are flooded or wind damaged, so farmers have lost enormous amount of income. Food prices soar, so they're food insecure. Water, clean water, will now be, of course, as you know, and I know there's a big debate about the use of the exporting of water from Karnataka to Tamil Nadu, but that's going to happen again next year. So, but further, the extreme rainfall caused sewage and waste overflows all over the city, spreading toxic and infectious waste, which then creates infections and other toxic exposures. Hospitals are overloaded. You can't drink the contaminated water. The fishermen on the coast are now having a lot of trouble getting healthy fish because there's so much oil from a local oil container that's spread into the ocean that all the fish along the coast there have died. So important, and my main point here is it looks pretty similar to heat, even though it's a radically different event, and the repercussions will be longer. It will take longer to recover than probably from a heat event, although I wouldn't necessarily bet my salary on that, but my guess is yes, because of the disruptive nature of floods. So in that flood, I was basically inconvenienced. I was locked in my apartment without power, and I had no internet, which was pretty frustrating when I was trying to work. And I had to go to bed at 8 o'clock at night because there was no light and there was nothing to do. I couldn't read. So I was frustrated. But I had enough food, whatever it was I had in the kitchen, I ate. I had fresh running water. Fine. Lots of people, of course, didn't, who were more than inconvenienced. And those people are the people that suffer with most social inequities and environmental disturbances. Those who are underserved, impoverished, low-income groups with health disparities. There are workers who are out there and were exposed for various reasons, including people that were trying to fix the electricity, were electrocuted. People with disabilities, of course, are stuck. If you're in a wheelchair and there's knee-deep water out in front of your house, you can't even trundle through it. Of course, people that are elderly, young children, infants, pregnant women, and then those with really severe areas where they couldn't get access to their medicines. And the number of stories about diabetes care lapses during that period. So half of the population of this country and of the world, in fact, is more vulnerable than the other half. On average, within classes and socioeconomic groups, because women tend to actually to have an extra burden for caring for the family. And they typically have unequal access and unequal power to make a difference, to acquire the protection that they need, be it technological or migration or whatever they need to do. So it's important to keep that in mind because women have a really critical role in maintaining communities and ensuring that we are resilient populations. So let's talk a little bit about resilience and some of the ways that we can fight back against these changes. So interventions and strategies, if you will. In the public health world, we talk about primary prevention, secondary prevention, and treatment and management. So it's sort of in a biomedical public health management. If you apply that to the climate space, what you get is, of course, the first thing we need to do is stop global warming or slow it down as best we can. So reducing emissions, that's the long-term critical action that needs to be taken. Happily, that can be done in ways that are directly promoting of health. So use of expanding and using green spaces, and I'll go into a little more detail, as well as active transport, both reduce mitigation and provide health to the people who are doing it. Secondary prevention, so these are the things that we talk about as adaptation. What does society do? Well, at the public health scale, of course, urban planning, water management, flood and sewer control. These floods would not be as serious if urban planning was done well, was followed through, was enforced. It's a challenge, and in a country the size of India, and the scale at which these cities have grown, it's no surprise that it's been difficult to do. But it is key, urban planning. But you could say the same thing for farming, water management in farms, crop selection, et cetera. Those large-scale system changes are really important. And of course, the things that are important for public health everywhere, disease surveillance, go back here, disease surveillance, vaccinations, et cetera, important to protect your health. They're more important in the context of climate change, and many, many health interventions are like that. Climate is essentially a multiplier of existing vulnerabilities and threats. But there are also very specific things that you probably have read about, cool roofs, and early warning systems to know when extreme events are coming. And now there's growing attention to how to deal with access to medical care and clinical services in remote challenge settings. So we think about a little bit back to this question about how mitigation and health benefits can go together directly. Reducing climate emissions by cycling is a great idea. Now, I showed this slide at Sri Ramachandra, and there was some snickering in the audience, right? Because this is not something you would see very many urban settings in India doing, right? Because this is Denmark, Holland, Utrecht, where they have a low density of population and really well-developed structure, low growth population. But the point, though, that these people are actually, lowering their blood pressure, reducing their blood sugar levels, and reducing their being able to manage their weight, increasing their respiratory capabilities by riding their bikes or walking to wherever they go. And so what needs to be done to make that possible is safe pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, reducing automobile use and others. And the data is overwhelming that this produces direct benefits to people. Now, I recognize this is not what it's going to look like in India, but we can do better than that. So, this is urban planning that's completely obtuse, right? This is intentionally placing a long-term barrier to use of a sidewalk. Nobody's going to walk through that, of course. So we can, by working, you can demand from cities that they begin to make infrastructural changes that might just be turning this thing sideways so you can walk around it. Small things to make it easier for people to walk safely without getting hit, and to walk, period. Green spaces, I mentioned, there's overwhelming evidence that, so I don't know if when you go to Lal Bagh Gardens, or you'll see lots of people out there walking in the mornings. It's no mystery why, right? I mean, people feel much better. The air's cleaner. Your blood pressure goes down immediately when you go into a nice, quiet, green space. So there's tons of evidence that green spaces in general, not in every case, but in general, reduce all-cause mortality, higher survivorship rates in cancer victims, mental health, mental well-being, blood pressure, and also blue spaces, if you will, where there's water and waterways, lakes that here are plentiful in this region. If well managed, they also facilitate water management to mitigate disasters. The adaptations, sort of individual housing, and there are hundreds of things that are being experimented on now. The one thing I will say is they're mostly going to be very useful, but do your homework. If you're decided, for example, well, Bangalore is not going to probably be in the market for cool roofs, but in Ahmedabad, where this study was done, there was a huge difference between, the tin roofs there. This is overall heat, And they put in a white painted roof, and it really didn't do much. And that is what is most often prescribed. Turns out that a concrete roof is actually really cooling. So a little bit of research goes a long ways, either individually, institutionally, to make sure that an adaptation is actually going to work. Sort of like vitamins, right? They don't work for all vitamins don't work for everybody. And you need to do your homework to make sure they're doing you any good at all. So this is my final slide and my final message, and that is, governments, national governments, state governments carry the lion's share of the responsibility for large-scale events, whether that's mitigation of climate emissions, policies related to fuel use and construction and agricultural subsidies, many things that drive climate emissions and many that drive public health. But we, as communities, in small groups and at a neighborhood level and at a larger level, can be very impactful. And the movement in many parts of the world of these, a university community or one that's organized by a neighborhood NGO, extremely impactful in changing the safety and well-being of communities around them. You know who are the populations at greatest risk in your community, where those people are and what they need. And you know what your community will support and maintain. So it's just a plea to feel empowered and not defeated and expect the national governments to take care of it, to leap in there, roll up your sleeves, and work with the networks that you have to make a difference, protect yourselves and your families and your communities. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. You showed some grim pictures, I guess that's what it is, but it ended up your last slide, the picture that you created out here to have a community. I would say, that the ideal community is maybe, towards a healthier future is probably really encouraging on that, right? So I think what we'll do right now, we'll open up the stage for question and answer. So we'll take questions from the audience. So.
So there's not very many of you, so you're sort of
right. So we have enough time, and we can take good number of questions. Yeah. So I think so Akanksha is there with the mic, so you can raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, Josh. That was a really nice talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think the mic is on. Is the mic on?
Yeah. Yeah, it's on.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now
Can you have the light up maybe a little bit in here? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good.
Okay, now
Thanks.
we are all set. So, towards the end of the talk, you suggested that, don't wait for somebody else to kind of take action and change, bring in the change, but you can yourself, organize within your communities and do something about it locally. So, I teach at, I actually teach at Azim Premji University, and what I sometimes see with the students is that they're all anxious about climate change. There's a lot of awareness about climate change. Yeah. But there's also a kind of, anyway, things are falling apart, so we might as well enjoy it till it lasts kind of a attitude. And honestly, there are too many problems, as you can see in Bangalore, traffic being the main problem to do anything. So I don't know how, I'm mostly asking you about the undergrads or the student community who have a slightly different kind of they're kind of angry about like the world they live in, or they have a different take on it. They might as well enjoy it till it lasts and then not worry about it too much, kind of an attitude. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, and that is not specific to Asamprenji. That is a global phenomenon. All of the United States, Europe. I haven't followed it in Africa, but I know in Latin America, it's with good reason. I mean, people are not just being, not giving up so easily, but the world's problems are daunting, no question. In a way, I think that this is one of the answers to kind of both those problems, that if we can motivate people not to be Pollyannish about you're going to solve climate change by recycling. I mean, there is way too much of that sort of nonsense, particularly when it's not executed well at scale. But to make community-based efforts where people see a difference in their neighborhoods, when I think that's actually very powerful. And one of the reasons, my daughters are also, I mean, you know, when I talk to them about adaptation, my younger daughter, Isabel, when I told her what I was doing and that I was working on research projects to develop new sort of evidence for adaptations, and she just looked at me and went, "That's it? It's just, we just have to get used to it and adapt to it?" And she's mad, and with good reason, right? So on the same quote. On the other hand, if one of the most powerful means of changing behavior is watching your neighbors and interacting with your neighbors. Like, you know, when in the U.S., and I can't speak for India, of course, but I think it is fairly fundamental. When somebody buys, you know, the latest iPhone, everybody around them goes, "Oh, God, I kind of need one of those too," you know. Or if somebody, you know, I put solar panels on the roof of our house 5 years ago, and my neighbors are always asking me about it, and I have gotten 4 or 5 other people started on projects to put solar on their roofs. Not because I pitch it really well, it's just I'm their neighbor. You know, he's done it, and it makes sense. Oh, actually, and I can tell him it's not as complicated, as hard, or expensive as you think, et cetera. So on a micro level, I think those changes actually add up and are probably among the most effective behavior change mechanisms we have. On a meso level, if you will, I think that when people get together to do those in groups, whether you create a solar network or a walking club so that we walk to work together in the morning, or bicycle ride, those are reinforcing socially, and it's a powerful visual kind of statement that I think may be helpful. And that's where I have to hope that we see more of that. I do believe it's true, but it's no question it's an uphill battle.
So I have a maybe like follow-up question on this. So, you know, what Dibber is people having, so, you know, sort of resistance to having a behavioral change, right? How much do you think actually, you know, education, again, climate change, our challenges are immediate, but we know we don't have a really like black and white type of like a solid answer or a solution to solve it. So it will have to be a long-term effort to solve it over time. So having said that, how much do you think is the importance of introducing the children at a much younger age about the science and the problems of it, and, you know, sort of build up a generation into it?
I certainly think we need to improve the way we do climate change education, climate education more broadly, and with whom. And the approaches, the messages, the media, the timing, all that, there's just, because it has not worked well the way it has in the last few years. And we have, at least in the US, a huge division between people who are not only resistant to behavior change, but resistant to belief. Because if they accept the fact that the climate is changing and that then we have to do something about it. And we have to do something about it means, one, I have to feel bad that I still want to drive my giant, gas guzzling vehicle and run my everything at top speed. But also, we don't want to feel bad, and we don't want to have to do anything about it. So there's a resistance that's motivated, if you will. I'm not an expert on child education, so I would be wary about it to make any substantive statement. But I think kids need to know. But it's also important to make sure you don't scare little kids.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's pretty easy to do until they really have a sense of what risk means and what uncertainty means. I mean, grown-ups have trouble with that. So, yeah, I would be cautious is all I'd say.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, please also, when you ask that question, introduce yourself as well.
Yeah. Good evening, Joshua. I think that was a very nice presentation. My name is Rajesh. I would like to know, how do you go about solving the air pollution problem? Like Beijing was one of the most polluted cities. I don't know if there's any city in the US. That is one of the problems that India is facing today, like Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Delhi. So do you have any suggestions as to how we can solve the air pollution problem? And number two, I saw, you had mentioned about the zoonotic diseases in one of the slides. So can you just explain what zoonotic diseases actually means?
Sure.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with the zoonotic disease one because it's more constrained. Zoonotic disease means a disease that is mainly an animal, non-human animal disease, that it has a normal cycle in animals. And most of those diseases I put up there are like that. That includes Ebola, things that are very pathogenic. For instance, bats seem to carry a lot of viruses, partly because they have these very slow immune systems that are able to tolerate them. But so it's still there, and it becomes, when it spills over into another species, particularly when it spills over into human, either there's contact that allows for that, and the conditions are right, not just contact, but other kinds of features like water, the right temperature, et cetera, that allows that disease to infect a person, then that's called the spillover event, and it's a zoonotic disease that becomes a problem in people. It often doesn't establish itself. They can be, they're called epizootic. You have a quick epidemic, it infects a group of people, but then it dies out in people because it really maintains the populations of that virus or a pathogen in its host species, whether it's a raccoon or a deer or a cow. So that's what a zoonotic disease is. They can be very dangerous because climate change is changing migratory patterns of animals around the world. And of course, we're doing a lot of things with managing domestic animals that puts them in contact with both people and wildlife. So the frequency of those spillover events is increasing because of the contact rates and the movement of those animals. That becomes a zoonotic problem that's related to climate change. Air pollution is a field that I've spent a lot of time in the last 7 or 8 years. I've mostly worked on exposure to household air pollution, so people who are cooking with wood or dung in their homes and are exposed to high concentrations of particulate matter and other toxins from burning those fuels. So there's one set of interventions around addressing those that have to do with transitioning to cleaner cooking fuels. And so we've done a lot of work, including here in India, on providing the sea of liquefied petroleum gas. It was a major program here, PMUI, if I can remember the name in Hindi.
The Ujjwala Yojana.
Yeah, that's what Ujjwala, yeah, scheme to make below poverty line households eligible for liquefied petroleum gas. It's not maintained. People did it right away. People loved it. And they stopped using wood and dung, which is more successful than I've seen it anywhere else in the world. That's one thing. It shows basically it's about poverty, and people can't afford those fuels. So that's one. There are lots of other clean technology. So that removes one direct exposure. Ambient outdoor air pollution is a result of automobiles, diesel fuels, factories, many of those, and happily, interventions that go to reducing automobile traffic and the combustion of diesel, coal, the worst polluting, are also some of the best interventions, the best ways to reduce climate emissions as well. Those are the big polluters for CO2, in particular, is coal, oil, and natural gas. If we stop burning those fuels, we would radically fix our air pollution problem and really quickly slow down climate warming too. It's just hard, right? So all over the world.
Yeah, so can you have the mic out there?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Hi, my name is Bhushan. I practice law. I'm from coastal Odisha. When COVID hit, I had the chance to go back home after a decade of living outside. And it was really, I spent 3 summers there. And I realized what I'd forgotten about the wet heat, the humidity that goes along with the extremely high temperatures and what that can do to you. And I was progressively more and more sort of worried about the situation. We got the roof of a house painted white. That had an impact, but because you're dealing with humidity here, and really the only solution that we realized was the air conditioning, and this was no longer a luxury. It was an essential item to be able to survive. And so my question here to both of you is that what do you see is the if you're to guess into the future, the impact on coastal areas, which are typically very highly populated. Do you think that people with means are going to move out? Do you think there's going to be massive depopulation, or do you think people are going to find ways of adapting? Because my personal experience was really hard to deal with when wet bulb temperatures. This was a term that I learned during that time. They cross a threshold, it becomes really difficult. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really important issue. And of course, many of the cooling devices that are used very effectively in arid areas from really hot temperatures, for instance, Martha, what's it called? What people use all over Arizona? Swamp coolers. And I know there's an Indian version here where you push air through water that cools it off, takes the heat off, and really efficiently reduces temperature. Unfortunately, if you're looking at humidity of above 60, 65, 80% relative humidity or more, 90 in many cases, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't cool anything down. And so air conditioning there's a lot of technology going on. I haven't seen, and maybe this is an area that you might know more about, but I agree, it's a huge challenge, and it's very clear that it increases the risk of heat stroke, so direct, thermal disease, because you just can't cool yourself off quickly enough.
So, I mean, let me add to what Josh has said. So, as part of our center, we are working with a lot of climate data, just to look at the climate futures across India in the near term, in the long term, like, in perspective. So in general, when the temperature goes up, there is a chance that humidity is going to go up because your air can take a lot more moisture. So from our analysis, what we are seeing that the coastal districts, they're going to have a lot more humidity. And so we also look at the thermal comfort using an index, we call it wet bulb temperature. So typically, if the wet bulb temperature is above 30 degrees Celsius, so you're in grave danger of, basically heat stroke and things like that. And that our eastern coast, a lot of these states are going to be either nearing that, or even in some of the districts are going to see 32 to 33 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. Some states in, some districts in Northeast, and some districts on the western coast. So then let me tell you one more thing on that. When you look at the Indian workforce, about 50% of the Indian workforce work outside. They have no access to air conditioner, coolers, or anything. So that puts that entire population into a grave danger of heat-related diseases in extreme, basically, health conditions. And just recently, like this year, in Kerala, I don't remember the year, they had to give a very long lunch break because of heat waves. Then some of the states in Northeast India, they had to close down schools for days, correct? And the point is, the system in place do not have a proper way of handling this. Either it's not well informed, there is planning has, doesn't have that component, how to deal with it. That's the current scenario. Then if the planning doesn't include this climate equation, I think we are heading into a very, how do I say, tense future. And we might end up getting into some very, very dangerous scenarios, right? When you especially think about the health and all. So, yeah.
Yeah. In other words, there's no easy answer to it.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for a very insightful talk. I'm Ekas Mai. I'm a PhD scholar, and my question, I have two questions actually. The first is regarding a parallel that I could see between climate change and the subject that I study, which is mental health. So during the pandemic, there was a huge uptick in people considering mental health as a priority. A lot more people took to therapy and interventions became a lot more active. While that was then, it's again gone down now because mental health no longer seems important. So I was wondering, what do you think about climate change and the criticality or the way the immediacy of the problem is viewed by the public? Does that have a factor to play in why there is lesser action on climate change versus other issues? The other question I have is something that had already come up in an initial question, which is when it comes to the onus of taking responsibility for change, why does it come back to the community when there are reports saying that the top 1 billion contribute to more emissions than 66% of the poorer populations? Why does it seem like resistance or status quo is motivated or incentivized because structurally there are no changes to be seen? So how does the onus come back to the community, and how do we motivate the community to act when bigger structures are not acting?
Yeah, great questions. I might need some clarification on the first one.
Sure.
But let me tackle the latter one if I can. Absolutely. Though, the top 1%, the top 10%, the top 25% 5% of the consumers on the planet, and particularly the United States is historically the largest producer of emissions. Today, that's China, followed by the U.S., followed by India, actually, the third largest annual contributor of greenhouse warming emissions. But all that CO2 that's in the atmosphere, 40% of it came from the U.S. and some large percentage. So absolutely. And so at a national level, richer countries and richer people's companies have to do their job. And part of mobilizing and acting at a community level is to force them to do that also. I mean, part of that climate action is to protect yourselves and your community by creating adaptations or community planning events that provide you health, well-being, and move the community, and then also are a means of activism to move governments. And so I don't think governments will move unless people tell them to. And that's anywhere in the world. And they tell them again and again in larger numbers and persistently, and it doesn't sort of disappear next week. The pandemic's over. We're not really thinking about COVID so much this year. It's not happening with climate change. It's just getting worse, right, progressively. So I'm hoping that there is not amnesia about it. So that's my first take on the who does what. The relationship to mental health was a little complicated, and I didn't know quite what you were asking there.
Sure.
There is a clear relationship between extreme weather events, trauma, PTSD. Those are documented mental health outcomes. There's also widespread what's called solastalgia, where it's, especially among, my children's generation and maybe your age too, because, we just feel like the world is suck and we're depressed. Is that a mental health problem, or is that just, realistic anger and loss of hope? And how those relate to clinical mental health is kind of a complicated discussion. We're having
I don't think I was asking about that, but let me just clarify. I think what I meant to say was during the pandemic, a lot more people considered mental health a priority because they were going through it. It was very immediate in their realm of everyday happenings. Whereas a lot of times the discourse on climate change is all about the future being at stake, the future being risky. But present day, we don't see it immediately happening, even though we can see that it's hotter these days. So my question was, does the criticality of a crisis matter when it comes to taking action? Because if the criticality or if the crisis is cumulative, do people seem to be less involved in taking change? Seriously.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's no question about that. If you look, so I've been working in global health now for almost 30 years. What gets people's attention is a scary infectious disease. It moves fast and it kills people. Everybody jumps on that. Maybe heart disease is actually killing more people over time, diabetes, but they don't inspire the action and immediate attention because it's not front and center and sort of frightening that way. So I'm sure you're absolutely right that the slow rate of climate change and also the complexity of it, it's so big and it's so complicated. What can I do as this one individual? Where I think one of the reasons that I emphasize extreme weather, because it isn't true major health outcomes, but it's also front and center. I was in extreme weather 2 weeks ago, right? Chennai is paying attention to climate change right now. I mean, they're thinking about it. Whether there's actually anything happening is to know, but they're talking about water. What do we do? in my organization, I started pushing a climate change and health program at the largest biomedical research enterprise in the world. Right? We fund half of the publicly funded medical research in the world. I could not get much attention among the senior physicians there for lots of reasons. It just didn't seem like their job. It was too far out for them to really sort of relate to. It was too complicated, all those things I've been talking about. Then things started getting pretty bad, right? So, there's a drum every year. The IPCC report increased, the problems get scarier. The extreme weather events get more serious. So we have to hope that drives some more action.
Thank you, Joshua. Those slides were really nice, as I told you right at the beginning, and very explicit, explained a lot. My question to you was on two of the slides. So one of the slides was India showing, where there was a lot of heat being generated, which was somewhere in the central part of India, and the north seemed to be relatively untouched in terms of the climate, in terms of the heat. So I wanted you to explain that. And the other thing was that you talked about the carbon dioxide. And I wanted to know that and the whole of India in that particular slide was red. Okay? I wanted to know that isn't there some impact of coastal areas that don't actually have that much carbon dioxide? Is there anything like that?
Carbon dioxide diffuses very easily around the planet. So the concentration differences are short term. You'll see around roadways higher levels, but it diffuses very quickly. And so the differences between coastal and other areas are probably not dramatic with respect to things like agriculture, not as much as the increase. So the concentration of CO2, and CO2 is taken up by plants and used for growth. So the implication there was that the growing concentration. So, CO2 levels are now approaching, what about 400?
420 is,
yeah, 420 concentrations. They were 300s in the low 300s.
316 in 1958.
Yeah. So, so that just the air has changed, right? So that matters. And the reason India was red there is because the dependence of the population on nutritional, on crops that are sensitive to this change is very high. So that's nutritionally, both in starvation and protein concentration, are very concerning to India. So I wondered, I'm glad you brought that up about that heat anomaly slide. So part of what's going on there, it's not the whole story, but if you remember though that there were countries that were hotter on average than most areas that were hotter on average over a period of time than others. And for India, you would think it was getting hotter, uniformly or at least substantially, especially in the north where you have real high heat in the north. Part of the issue is that high air pollution has this perverse effect. Some black carbon in particular, but maybe I don't know if other kinds of particulate matter.
Yeah, PM mostly, particulate matters, yeah.
Yeah, it acts as a coolant because it's reducing the insulation from the sun. Maybe you can explain that better.
Yeah, I mean, that's, just going back to, what we were asking. So this movement of greenhouse gases in atmosphere is not compartmentalized. It's not that if you have lesser CO2, maybe in some areas in one city, it's going to have an immediate impact, in here. So when it comes to climate change, we talk a lot about the Arctic, right? And then we talk, a lot of teleconnections. to what is going on in some parts of the world, how that is going to have an impact on another parts because of the overall atmospheric circulation. That impacts your rainfall, the temperature, and that gets into smaller circulation, and that creates your, I mean, I should not say island effect, but your localized event. So this is very more complex. It's not like urban heat island effect. It's a bit more complex than that. And then what is the next thing we're seeing right now? I think we're talking about the heat island effect, right? Or no?
I didn't hear the heat island effect. Maybe you were referring to that. I think you were talking about differential CO2 spatially. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that has a component to what Josh said right now. So there are some very famous effects. One is called Pinutova effect. So volcanoes like basically erupted, then there's a lot of like black carbon like in the atmosphere, because there is a, like a layer which is stopping the your sun ray coming in. So that actually cooled that area for a year or like years. Same thing, we do have a huge plume. If you look at even on Google Earth, right, on the northeast India around that, there is more concentration of particulate matter, mainly because of the overall circulation. That has a cooling effect as well. And I don't know, we are also actually observed that India's, I think around central India and northwest India, when you look at the temperature anomaly, it's actually having a cooler effect. That might have something to do with, again, PM or something else. We don't quite know. But I have a different angle. So when you think about, seeing part of the world which is having, say, plus 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase, then you take a part of India, say Uttar Pradesh, or I'm just giving it a name. It has 1 degree Celsius temperature anomaly, but then you try to think about the population density that area has compared to some part in Alaska, right? So that's a very different level of impact that we are actually thinking, right? So again, the impact of climate change, as Josh was pointing out, it's a very complex process, right? Everything boils down to how this is going to impact the population in there and the resources that actually we are having access to. So, it's somewhere you might be seeing 1 degree Celsius temperature increase. Some other parts you'll be seeing 5 degrees Celsius. But then what is impacting what? That's probably like something more to actually look into. But that cooling effect, those 2 points, we don't quite understand yet on this. But in general, in India, again, I'm kind of going tangentially in here. In general, what we see that India, our summer monsoon, is going to shift from east of India to the west of India. And that's when actually, I think if I remember the migration slide that you showed, I saw a really high migration into that western coast of India, includes Gujarat, Rajasthan and all. And over there, we're going to see a lot more rain and desert area, the impact on agriculture, and what actually is going to cause on that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting. I was actually talking to a group of our foundation people this morning. We're kind of having similar discussions. Ozone does have some impact, but when it comes to greenhouse gases, we mostly talk about few greenhouse gases. This has predominant impact. We talk about CO2 because it comes from the overuse of fossil fuel. But another major greenhouse gas is actually water vapor. Because water vapor, it's a lot more abundant out there. Then CO2, our go-to greenhouse gases, because it's coming directly out of what we are doing, right? With use of our fossil fuel. Then comes methane. So methane, why we talk about it? Because methane has, I think, about 24 times global warming potential compared to CO2. Then your NOx, which is a lot more higher than, like few other gases. But the point is, say NOx is in trace amount compared to the other gases. So ozone, I don't remember, what is, if there is any contribution, it's going to be really trace on that. Right.
You're cutting down trees.
Yeah.
Your lakes, you're not maintaining the lakes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you maintain ecological balance, most of these problems can be solved.
Absolutely. I mean, yes. So that.
So the government has to do a lot of things in this area.
Absolutely. So that's why maybe kind of going back to the question that I forgot your name. What you're saying. Why everything has to come down to the community? It has to come down to the community. Because if we are going to mobilize the government, the force will have to come from the community. So that's why the climate change used to be someone else's problem. I started this in 2006, and then you can't really talk, say as a PhD student, you cannot go and tell everybody you're doing climate change because you don't know, what the reaction is going to be. Now, I can go and talk to a lot more people that I'm involved with climate change, because there are a lot more people who are actually going to talk to me, at least take an interest, right? There's some shift on that. In a country like India, and remember the slide that Josh showed, right, from the footpath, right, how it was blocked. That is in place, right? From there, we have to move that box sideways, right? I'm just giving examples on that. How you change the attitude, correct? How you mobilize it, how you impact the policy. According to me, according to us, actually, the way we work in the center, you have to create this mass movement. And that's why we think that we have to educate people en masse, from the school children to the senior people, about what's going on, starting from environment to climate change, right? And once people understand it a lot better, then when people talk, that's a movement. And then you can actually make the people who has power to implement policy to take it seriously. Otherwise, if we just stay on the superficial level, or we just talk about climate change, once we see a flood in Chennai or a collapse in Josephat, it's not going to change. It has to be in mainstream. It has to be on daily discussion, daily talk, in an informed way, and then people probably will start taking us seriously. I mean, again, it will take time, I guess, but yeah, that's how I see it. Oh, yeah.
That was a very interesting talk. I have, you probably don't have enough time to answer questions because it's 5 to 8. Some comments which might appear to be questions, I'm not a climate change skeptic, and I hope I'm not too much of a cynic. But some of the examples that you gave and the person from Orissa who's just left gave, there are some obvious answers to that. For example, the floods in Madras, I still call it Madras, I don't call it Chennai. The commissioner of the Madras Municipal Corporation was on TV about a week ago, and when he was asked about why these things are happening more often, instead of answering that question, he said, I was there even when the 2015 flood occurred. But one very obvious reason is because the floodplains around the city have been built up. And this is not encroachment, this is a deliberate government policy. And it hasn't even provided adequate employment in relation to how much has been invested. And that's because, whether it's bureaucrats or politicians, they're interested in how many billions of investment has come into that state or into that particular region. The other kind of example is, for example, you're talking about the Snickers that accompanied your slide of people cycling. That's also because Ramchandra is a very privileged place. It's an expensive private university, and most of the people who are there are entitled in one way or the other. And therefore, they wouldn't dream of riding a bicycle after they were 4 or 5. By the same token, when the gentleman was talking about how when he went back to Odisha and he couldn't live without air conditioning, that's also because I grew up in Madras, although I was born here. And at that time, summer temperatures were typically 45 degrees centigrade plus. Schools were closed between April and June because that's the hottest part of the year. But most people survived with ceiling fans, even the wealthy. They didn't have air conditioning. They can still do that, but because air conditioning is available and because the taxes on air conditioners are being reduced, more people are going in for that kind of thing. The reason that I'm giving these sorts of examples is that part of the reason why this is happening is not only because of climate change, but because of many deliberate actions that governments are taking which don't allow you to mitigate against normal climate events, leave alone the effects of climate change. To extend it one step further, if I may, having non-stop flights between India and the US, for example, the carbon dioxide that's emitted is typically 60% more than if you had one stop in between. And that's easily, I mean, if you go into Google Flights, you can actually see the figures in terms of kilograms of CO2 per passenger. 60% more.
I thought it would have been the opposite, actually.
But actually, you would assume that because you have to take off in this thing, that you would use more thing. But because these long-range aircraft are essentially flying tankers, therefore, you're emitting much more carbon dioxide per capita.
Thank you very much. So actually, you are. This is the last question or comment that you took. Thank you very much for showing up and listening to Josh, and thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, really for interesting talk.